from a humanitarian perspective, what we observe now is that we are always operating in strong states, and we're not operating in failed states anymore, to the extent that we are still wondering if the sans frontières is still possible, because the environment has changed so dramatically. But you're right, even though there are, most of the states are legitimately sovereign states at the moment, still there is a major difference between being able to provide a humanitarian aid in North Korea, in Myanmar, and in Sudan, right? So I think it's not just, it's a combination of different factors. It's not just the public opinion or the pressure from government. It's also the willingness of the country to accept a certain amount of aid in order to maintain this balance and this capacity or transparency that they want. In Sudan, for example, we are managing huge program in South Sudan, and it's in the interest of Khartoum, right? That we are supporting this what they used to call post-conflict environment, which is not one anymore, as we know. In Myanmar, we've also been able to conduct operation to some extent because we are providing HIV treatments to 75% of the patients who are receiving treatment for HIV/AIDS. The only difference in North Korea is that they are also willing to accept a big number of organizations, because these organizations they're good conscience, right? But for us, it was just the bottom line, and we say that it was not acceptable. But you never know if we were right or wrong, actually. It's just a stance that we've taken, but we're not sure it's the right one. It's a political choice that we make at some point.
Hi, I'm Laura. I'm again, a BJA student, and I'm interning at Japan Society. There you mentioned Obama, and I was wondering if you see a distinct change in your organizations as we go from the Bush era to Obama, and whether the new sort of attitude of multilateralism is making an impact on any of your organizations.
I can start. I mean, certainly anytime that you put civil rights and human rights in the same sentence, Obama's going to, at some point, be part of that paragraph. There are a lot of ways to interpret that, and there are a lot of different ways to interpret him. I think what I would say, though, is that it's unclear exactly from a humanitarian and a human rights point of view what the Obama administration is going to do. He governed, he campaigned in the poetry of human rights. So far, he's governing in the prose of a pretty practical, calculated, and in some ways fundamentally not changing a lot of the directions when it comes to some of the fundamental human rights issues. And I think that's because he's realized that it's quite difficult. There are choices you have to make, and there are trade-offs you have to make. But certainly, I think that there is an openness to internationalism as a positive thing that has been the big change, both in the American public and in the international community in the other direction. And I think that that is currency that he has not quite spent yet, and I'm not sure how he's going to spend it.
Yeah, I funnily enough I was doing some interviews at the UN today and asked exactly that. Have you really felt a shift from Bush to Obama? And it was a resounding yes, in the sense of these particular staffers saying what they felt is that now they're being listened to and respected. Like, even if the policies haven't shifted, or even if whatever, it's just the tone of the dialogue and the discussion and the day-to-day interactions. There's just been a sea change. What that's going to lead to, we'll wait to see.
Simon.
Hey, I'm Simon. I'm another BGA student. This question, I guess, is I'm most interested in Sophie's response, but I would be curious to see how the others would give different answers. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on sort of the process of planning an intervention? What are sort of the key elements that go into it, and maybe you sort of highlight which are sort of the essential elements that intervention can't succeed without, and the ones that are just sort of useful to have?
You mean when we plan it to respond to an emergency,
right?
Well, it's quite different if it's a natural disaster and if it's a man-made disaster. And it's also different if we are already working in the country or if we're not. So I can give you an example of a natural and man-made disaster in a country where we're working and where it was challenging. Zimbabwe, for example. We've been working for years in Zimbabwe. Most of the NGOs last year were expelled by Mugabe. Surprisingly, we were allowed to stay, and I think it's because we had 22,000 patients on HIV treatment, so they were not, that irresponsible. So we could stay, and when the cholera outbreaks started, it's been easy to some extent to respond immediately because we have some experience in that, but it's been extremely challenging to negotiate with authorities the ability to use the health structure to employ the staff, to mobilize existing resources, and to add our own resources. So what we do, and the planning process is very different from one country to another, but there are principles. The principle is to be able to assess the needs, to see if we can respond to them, to get the authorization to do so, and to be able to mobilize the necessary resources and authorization. And if it's not enough, and if really it's outraging, and there is no way, and we see the population just dying, and the authorities refusing to intervene, or if there is a lack of intervention because we just can't respond to a nationwide emergency, in that case we would support our operations with advocacy. But we usually start with exploration and negotiation at field level.
My name is Jessica. I'm from Teachers College. I was just wondering if you considered access to education a current challenge confronting humanitarian aid, and if so, what do you think is the most pressing issue for education aid?
I actually would answer it in the flip of probably the way I asked it. I think one of the most difficult things, and it reminds me of a story I heard last night, is educating those who are well-intentioned but not used to delivering humanitarian aid in a lot of situations. I think that the folks we have on the panel are probably immune to this problem, but we have seen, especially when you get back to the consumerism point that I made, when you have companies who try to come in and deliver humanitarian goods, they often aren't educated enough on the context of the situation, and so they end up delivering what they think the answer is, but not actually thinking it all the way through. The story I heard last night was water pumps in villages in East Africa, and no sense of the maintenance of those long term. And what ended up happening was not only weren't they maintained, but they weren't perceived as being owned by the village. They were perceived as being somebody else's pump that we happen to use, and once it breaks down, well, it's somebody else's problem to actually fix. So not a real sense of, let's educate ourselves on the situation that we're in. When you're in country for so long, you get so much of that context. And from a human rights perspective, clearly education is a human right. It's within the overall framework. Delivering it is an issue that you have to get basic rights first before you can really get to education stability. But I think that more of the problem is making sure as more and more actors try to deliver humanitarian aid to make sure that they're educated on the situation.